Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we will be discussing imperialism. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, what is imperialism? Second, what motivated imperialism in the 19th century? Third, how did Western European nations imperialize nearly all of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Oceania? And then what are the lasting legacies of imperialism? So what is imperialism? Imperialism is a policy in which a dominant state takes control of distant colonies using some means of force. So let's break that down. First of all, at its root, at its core, imperialism is really just about empire building, where you have a dominant state expanding its control over distant colonies, oftentimes through military force. But one of the things that's unique about imperialism, which occurred in period 5, was that increasingly we're seeing other sorts of force, especially economic pressures that are placed on distant colonies or distant regions that don't even sometimes involve direct political control. So for example, in this image, you see a cartoon showing the British shoving opium down the mouths of the Qing dynasty in China, right? That was a way in which the British were able to maintain control over Chinese through economic means and through the sale of opium. Here you see Uncle Sam controlling a donkey, representative of Latin America. So the United States does not go in and directly control politically Latin American countries, but indirectly through both military pressure and through economic pressure and through corporations who are heavily invested in Latin America. The United States will maintain essentially indirect control over Latin America. So empires aren't new in the 19th century and the 1800s. We've been talking about empires as far back as the Classical Age with the Achaemenids in like 600 BCE. What's different is that empires really are growing on a previously unattainable scale. They're becoming really globalized in terms of their scope. Now, we saw in period 4 the formation of maritime empires in the Americas, but really we're sort of taking this even to a broader level. The major imperialist nations were those that had really first industrialized, starting with Britain, and then France, the Netherlands, Germany, and then finally the United States and Japan are also two major imperialist powers. So if we kind of go back and think about period 4, we talked about what we could maybe refer to as first wave colonization, mainly between 1500 and 1750, mostly in the Americas, mainly again involving in Latin America, Spain, Portugal here. One of the things that's unique about first wave colonization was there was a number of Europeans who came over and settled and stayed permanently in the Americas and displaced many of those indigenous peoples of the Americas. So in period 5, we're going to see a shift as many of these colonies in the Americas gained independence through revolutionary movements. We see really a change of focus on where these empires are starting to form. And so we refer to this sometimes as second wave imperialism between 1750 and 1900, mainly in Africa, Southeast Asia, Oceania down here. And one of the things that's different about second wave imperialism is, first, the players are a little bit different. So while Spain and Portugal were the main players in period 4, Britain and France become the major players in period 5 in second wave imperialism. Some other major differences, with the exception really of Australia here, where there was some permanent settlement by the British, and down here in South Africa, really the rest of Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia was not significantly occupied by Europeans who moved to these regions. Instead, they engaged in a lot of indirect rule over the territories within their empires. So what motivated imperialism in the 19th century? A number of different things. First, industrialization, the need for natural resources. We really need to make sure that we are pairing together in our minds the major movement of imperialism in period 5 and the larger changes that are taking place worldwide with the Industrial Revolution. So remember the desire for natural resources, for raw materials, and also markets to turn around and sell those finished goods. So a great example is when it comes to India and Egypt, both colonized by the British, partly because of the natural resource they possess, which was cotton. So cotton, which was being exported in mass quantities from these colonies to Great Britain, where they were being pumped through these machines, turned into finished textiles, and then the British would take those finished textiles and sell them back, oftentimes to these colonies for a profit. So be aware of that connection. India and Egypt were cotton is being produced, and ultimately Great Britain, who is taking that cotton and turning it into finished textiles. And here's why, because the British had these factories that were pumping out textiles, and the Indians, who also produced their own handmade textiles, and the Egyptians, who made their own handmade textiles, they could not compete with the British manufacturing just because of the quantity that they could produce at such a low price with such a high quality. Another example is the connection here between empire and the naming of various teas. So English breakfast tea, Yorkshire tea, these are two brands of tea, and yet how much tea is grown in Great Britain? None. There's not hardly any tea at all grown in Britain. All of the tea is grown around the world. The difference is that tea was then imported into Great Britain, where it was manufactured, placed in tins, and then ultimately sold. And therefore, many of the teas are named after cities or towns in England. Now, some other examples. In South Africa, the Dutch and then later the British are going to discover a variety of mineral resources like gold and diamonds, which is going to lead to the growth of mining centers and colonies like South Africa. Mining is a very labor-intensive process. You need workers, and where are they going to find those workers? Are the British going to send workers down? No, they're going to extract labor from local South Africans who work in these mines in really pretty awful conditions for very low wages. And then a lot of that wealth then is flowing to British companies, British corporations like De Beers, controlled by Cecil Rhodes, a British company that made extraordinary amounts of wealth off the backs of South Africans. Another example, copper was a resource that's found both in Africa and also in Mexico. So metals, there's an increased demand for metals. And U.S. corporations are going to go to Mexico, and they're going to set up mines in Mexico, and they're going to exploit labor and also extract resources from Mexico for their own benefit. Another prime example of this is in Belgium, where we had King Leopold, who established a colony here in Central Africa and the Congo region near the Congo River. And he is going to extract wealth using a coerced labor system. So Congolese men were required and forced to go into the Congo, into the forest to extract rubber, which was being utilized by the Belgians in order to produce tires for both bicycles and cars, which were new innovations right around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And if they refused to, they oftentimes had their hands chopped off. So this was a very cruel forced labor system that resulted in extraordinary focus of labor away from just growing average everyday food for people. The result was high numbers of people dying of famine, so we end up with what amounts to essentially a genocide in Congo, with estimates between 5 to 10 million Congolese people dying as a result of the policies imposed by King Leopold. Unless you think that the world has learned the mistakes of the past and that racism is no longer a thing. In certain towns in Belgium, you can buy still chocolate hands, which really just shows how evil sometimes human beings can still be. Now, a second major motivating factor was location, geopolitics. So certain imperial powers wanted to gain access or location to some strategic geographic spots. So a great example, the British had another colony in India, and so they were forced to go all the way around Africa. Well, that all is going to change in the late 1800s with the building of the Suez Canal here in Egypt, which is going to shorten the journey by about half. So the British taking control of the Suez Canal for geopolitical or geostrategic purposes. Other examples in the Americas, the United States is going to directly control the Panama Canal and is going to essentially foment a revolution in Panama for the purpose of taking control of that territory. Another example is the United States taking control of Hawaii and various other islands across the Pacific in order to establish naval bases. A third factor motivating imperialism is nationalism, or this drive to compete, ultimately to build the largest empire around the world. So nations wanted to achieve national superiority, and that was demonstrated by being the strongest economic power, the strongest military power, and having the largest global empire. This concept of nationalism involves a few different things. One, it's the sort of patriotism or sense of devotion that one has towards one's nation state, which is a force that ultimately is bringing people together, oftentimes around similar cultural characteristics, whether that's language or religion or ethnicity. At the same time, though, we have to think about nationalism as being a force that is contrary to imperialism, because empire building really involves creating a territory that is large and diverse in terms of language or religion or ethnicity. And therefore, it was really a challenge for nation states at that time to maintain a common identity while at the same time building a global empire. So we see this oftentimes in images such as this one, showing the glory of the lion is in his mane. And if you look closely, that's because Canada and India, Australia, New Zealand, and the African colonies are all part of this larger idea of the British nation state or the British Empire. Now, a fourth motive for imperialism was a cultural motive. Christian missionaries were intent on spreading the faith, and this is a carryover from period 4. In period 4, we talked about how Christianity spread to the Americas. In period 5, we're focusing more on spreading Christianity to sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia like Vietnam. Another strong cultural motivation, in addition to spreading Christianity, was this idea that it was the responsibility of nations who are engaged in imperialism, like Great Britain here and like the United States, to ultimately bring civilization to what were perceived to be these barbaric or backwards people, ignorant people of the world. For instance, you see here the British carrying a person from China and Africa and India. And here we have the United States carrying someone from the Philippines and Cuba and Hawaii. And it's images like this that should scream out to you racism, right? That this idea that it was the responsibility of the United States to civilize, to bring education, to bring civility to a barbaric or backwards people. We see it also in images like this one, showing people of European ancestry bringing civilization to the barbaric people of whether it be Africa or Asia. So a fifth motivating factor is racism, and another term for this that we'll use is social Darwinism. So tied up to this is a term that was first used in a Rudyard Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden. People of European ancestry saw themselves as more culturally advanced. And we can see it in this advertisement. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, Pear soap. So you can see racist images like this showing people of white European ancestry literally handing soap to people of Africa or the people of Asia in order to ensure that they were sufficiently clean. And this is the idea of bringing, again, civilization to these what were perceived by Europeans at the time more backwards people. Another way in which we can understand this is Europeans were justifying their actions, in many cases the exploitation of labor and the extraction of resources, by asserting that they were actually benefiting the people of Africa and Asia that they were imperializing, because these people were biologically and ethnically inferior as a result of distinctions that had come about. And so this is where the term social Darwinism comes in, right? Charles Darwin was a scientist who developed a number of theories around natural selection and survival of the fittest, that certain species had characteristics that were more advantageous. And when this was applied, unfortunately, in context of race, white Europeans then utilized the distinctions that they perceived to justify some of the actions that they were taking. And so this really is a fifth justification or explanation for imperialist policies that were pursued by people of European ancestry, including the United States during this period. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video were, first, what is imperialism? And second, what motivated imperialism in the 19th century? We'll address the other two questions in the next video. Thanks for watching.